This brings me to the introduction of our poet tonight. We are delighted to have John here. He is the author of book Controlled Hallucinations, which is out earlier this year in 2013, and also the author of 6 poetry chapbooks. He's the winner of the Heart Poetry Award and finalist for the Pushcart, Rumi, and the Pinch Poetry Prizes. John serves as the editor of the Inflectionist Review, as co-director of the Walt Whitman 150 Project, and marketing director of Inkwater Press. He has also edited 2 local poetry anthologies, Alive at the Center and Motionless from the Iron Bridge, a Northwest anthology of bridge poems. A few previous publishing credits include Third Coast, Nimrod International Journal, Inkwell, Cider Press Review, Bryant Literary Review, Rhino, and various anthologies. He lives in Milwaukie, Oregon. Yeah. Let's give him a hand for that. With his wife, 3 cats, a Boston Terrier, and a 1945 Royal Deluxe typewriter. Yes. That was I learned earlier that was a gift from his wife. And I also learned, I didn't know this, I used to have a Royal typewriter, so I remember those, but mine was a portable. This was the model that Hemingway wrote on, a Royal Deluxe typewriter. Right? So would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, John Sibley Williams.
But thank you, Tom, for inviting me, and thank you again to the library. I enjoy coming here and have actually lived in Milwaukie for about a year and a half now with my wife, and so just live right up the road. It could almost walk to a reading, which has never happened before. And it's wonderful. Thanks everyone for coming out. It's bitterly cold out, so the fact that you're not at home with the holiday tree and sitting beside a fire, like I'm sure some people are going to be doing in about an hour. So thank you for deciding to come out this evening. I wanted to, as opposed to just my own work, given what had happened earlier in the week, I wanted to dedicate this reading to the passing of someone I'm sure we all know who I'm going to say. And with the passing of Nelson Mandela. And there's a poem, which I'm sure many of you know, titled Invictus, that over the 28 years in which he was in prison, he would read this poem to other people, the other people, political prisoners, to give them hope in such dark times. And I know there's a film recently also titled Invictus, kind of based on the same thing. But so there's this poem. It is by William Ernest Henley. And this, again, is the poem that gave Mr. Mandela so much hope and inspiration in all those years. And this is Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloodied, but not bowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. So that was the poem Invictus again, and for Mr. Mandela. Obviously, he will be missed. And moving into, I don't know, about less weighty stuff, but not quite as sad, perhaps. I figured I would read the poem. I figured I would start with. Oh, actually, I was going to say this. I'm sorry. with a poem. I figured to start the reading, I may as well start at the beginning, so to speak. And this poem is called The Voice in the Shell. If it really began with a woman 10,000 years ago, placing conch to ear, listening interrupted and enhanced by translation, to form this sea that separates us, I would build a time machine and retrace the roots of metaphor, language, superstition, expectation, back to that older world without magic, and sit for a moment holding your hand that is not yet a hand, listening together to the sea that hasn't yet a voice. So trying to go back in time a little bit there. And speaking of going back in time, the poem that's on the broadside, so I figured I would give everyone, for those who have it, yeah. I would say then everyone takes it out and then, okay. Also going back in time, as those who maybe had read it beforehand, you may have noticed, being about the Holocaust, having gone to a couple concentration camps when I had lived in Europe for a few years, and one in particular, Mauthausen, in northern Austria. And so this poem kind of came from that, and it begins with a quote from Elie Wiesel, the author of Night. He says, "Some stories are true that never happened." And this poem is called As Tattoos Fade. Suddenly, from all that's decayed around you, the night held inside recedes. From the boots that define your silence, a rough outline of song emerges. Into the torn open wound of sky, a chimney releases birds. After numbers have erased each letter, your name begins to take shape on the skin of your arm, and without the need for skin. Since the sun has already learned to die, but still burns our eyes, it is your turn to invent how we see morning. It was quite interesting about being in Mauthausen that particular time, was that we all know what the chimney was for, the giant chimney in the middle of the camp. But when I was looking at it, and staring at it for quite a while, of course, a big flock of blackbirds just poured right out of it, and it was absolutely stunning. There's this alpine, it's just in the middle of this gorgeous alpine valley, so minus the history, it seemed so very strange to me that so much beauty can be both surrounding but also within. I mean, the birds were probably roosting and living in this chimney. And so it was very touching for me, the contradiction kind of there. Slightly later, this next poem, I was trying to think of what it would be like in 1969, I believe it was, when for the first moon landing. And maybe some people can tell me if this is at all what it was like, but I wasn't quite. Yeah, I think my parents were thinking about me. Maybe they just hadn't gotten around to, But I was trying to imagine what it would be like if before that, the moon, kind of like a star, for example, had always been a metaphor. It was something people perhaps wished on the moon. It was just some sort of ephemeral thing. It was really almost a metaphor in itself. It probably wasn't an actual body, but then to see people, to see human beings planting a flag, playing golf, stepping on this thing that you once thought was ephemeral, how that might feel. This is called We Know the Moon Has Edges. The image arrives decades late, having traveled through too much darkness to comfort anymore. There it is, evidence of a crisp, unambiguous lip. The moon becomes a body like any other. a body that ends. The dreams we've hung from the myth of night, suicide into colder day. Our children begin questioning if stars too belong to the world. They grow so much older in our silence. Some argue it was better when reality remained a theory, when there were things we couldn't touch. I realize I haven't touched my own face in some time. So I toss the moon in a shoebox of postcards, unanswered letters, watches, seashells, and other proofs of my life. In time, it will yellow and crack into memory, and I'll rediscover that heavenly body in the attic beneath a pile of family photos. I'll dust the cobwebs from its milky surface and fondly remember what I once believed in. I don't know, was it anything like that? No, everyone was probably excited, right? I'm not sure if that feeling came a bit after, perhaps, but hopefully not. Thinking a bit about the kind of classic, I'm not sure what the theory is called, but that idea of a butterfly wafting its wings, perhaps, centuries ago, and just the smallest thing and how that might change things. This poem is called Bondage. I am afraid my writing the word love will mean the end of a species. I am afraid the decision to embrace will erect another wall around Jerusalem. If I had wings, flight might devastate an ice cap. But if I fail to write, decide, or fly, if each gesture lingers flagless, awaiting storm for allegiance, if I am a closed door in a room with 1,000 open windows, I am afraid even my silence will explode into consequence, a candle shattered by the spectacle of its temporary light. This next poem had, it's hidden well in there, but I was actually thinking about my grandfather in this poem. In some of my newer poems, I'm trying to not keep cards quite as close to my chest. I'm much more on the conceptual level and don't often put a lot of personal stock, a mental stock, but as opposed to emotional stock into poems. And in thinking of my grandfather, that classic Boston Irish guy, was in World War II and all that, and that idea of people not knowing what to do with themselves after having been in a war for so long. That idea of what, that on some level, purpose almost seems to vanish. And this poem is called Post-War. How the slow train moves steadily away. The survivors still line-bound, but without destination. Blood-rooted in an absent struggle. Home, a language fashioned for the dead. Steadily, this slow train crosses the nation of our bodies, tattoos deep into our pastures. Bone on bone on bone on an overly forgiving green landscape. With no one left to repurpose the cold steel of bullet into compass and meaning. Steadily, as if each breath has not always been a forged passport. Every drop of shed blood, a map of some undiscoverable country. I'm sure we're all that way at some point in life when you're younger and you take certain things perhaps for granted. You get a bit older and realize perhaps you shouldn't have. Usually, of course, it's too late at that point, which I guess is what it is. But this next poem is very short, and it's quite new, but decided to bring it because some people may have cut down Christmas trees recently, perhaps. This is called Tree Fall. A jagged circular incision to the halfway point of broken. Then we rest a night, metal teeth lodged in the center, a quiver with song. The evanescing canopy overhead is a garden filled with birds, living and dying. Varied definitions of escape. Tomorrow will be an acceptance of fallen bodies. Not per se about Christmas tree cutting, but coming from Massachusetts, we always had fake trees. Probably different out here. I'm actually going to break this up into sections, make it more interesting, hopefully for everyone, and certainly for myself also. So this is the last poem in this section. This is called This Cage of Light. Bound for opposite destinations, one passenger train just collided with another. A Navy jet just dropped from near heaven into a nameless town that's now discovered its fame. I lay the newspaper, tragedy down, over our naked legs, merged together like fossils. Tomorrow, Paris may simply dissolve into the Seine. The northern lights harden into mountains. The earth may crack open, vanish buildings and gardens, along with my father's silence from my blood. And the sun may creep 1 inch closer to us, just an inch, the length of our son's finger. And through the hollered prayers and curses, you might finally hear me whisper, I've never loved you more than I will tomorrow. I'm not sure if that's a love poem or an anti-love poem. I've heard both interpretations from people. Could go either way, perhaps. Okay, so I want to do something a little, hopefully interesting. I have a number of ekphrastic works, and so I want to do kind of a show and tell fun thing. So the first of which, for those who aren't familiar with ekphrastic work, in this case, most of these had been just the inspiration that I found from particular pieces of art and writing toward those. And I wanted to start off with one of my favorite painters. I have quite a few in our house, Edward Hopper. For those who are familiar, there's just something about Hopper's houses in particular that they just almost seem like faces to me. They seem like people. They have stories that are untold, and I've always been very moved by his work. And the first poem that I have based on Edward Hopper's work, and I actually would almost argue that a lot of my poems have some sort of basis in his work. I'm not quite sure why. I often have houses with empty totally unpopulated houses with empty windows. Sometimes they're along rail tracks, and I feel like I can trace it back to him. But as you may know, some of his, unfortunately I can't quite prop this up well, but many of his pieces, probably are often urban women, often in apartments, seeming at least very melancholy. Also, something else that's quite famous is one of my favorite pieces of his are just gorgeous from across the nation, often from the Midwest, landscapes with different houses. And again, this is one of my favorites. It seems to it just tells a whole story in and of itself. I tagged some pages. Another one of my favorites, and the reason I'm showing these particular ones is because certain elements of them actually show up in the poem. So another one of my favorites we have on our wall downstairs. Absolutely love that idea. I think when people talk about living on the ocean, I don't think they mean quite that. But, and the last one I wanted to show. Okay, this is kind of a classic, one of his classic motifs. And this kind of beautiful urban melancholy on some reason, on some way. So anyway, so for those who've seen those, I'm going to put this right here. That's why I brought this up. There we go. So you can at least see one of them. So with that as a background, this poem, which was in Inkwell last year, this poem is called Always There Is a Woman, and it's for Edward Hopper. Always there is a woman. At times she is a house left unlit alongside rail tracks. A brief slant of shadow dissecting the perfect image of a lighthouse. She only exists at this certain angle. At times she is a man and a woman, both, ignoring the transparency of windows. Sometimes she is one or the other, and an empty mirror. At times she is black and white. At times black or white, recognizing in the other her unfinished metaphor. At times she moves like a clock. There is dusk in her face. At times she is me and nothing more. Then I look away. But always there is a woman who is a doorless frame opened to the ocean. Or there is a promise of salt and wind just outside the canvas. So that's kind of based on those images that you'd seen. And it's like show and tell. It's like for kids again. All right. I have another Edward Hopper poem, mainly based, I can't really prop this one up. I'm going to hold it. All right. It is mainly based, and I'm sorry for those who maybe can't see it at quite this angle. It'll be difficult for me to hold and read. Mainly based on this picture, as you see with the woman looking out upon the red brick building and the roof, looking out upon the city. This poem is called Room with a View. The clockmaker lies on a bed surrounded by time in various broken states and thinks of what he might see if he looked out the window. Like an animal becoming human, the city pulses red below its skin, rises from bone into self-reflection, and thinks of what it might see through the eyes of a man who looks elsewhere. Their days are spent tinkering with springs that continue to uncoil, winding hands forward and back, moving people closer to understanding that they move ever closer. And it makes no difference that there's a woman across the alley wearing a necklace that might be the sun, rising and setting with each heavy breath. How she remains at the open window all day and night in various broken states, and thinks of what she might see if she closed her eyes. That's based on that one. And if, I'm going to have a big pile of stuff. Okay. For those who are familiar, I'm sure many people are probably familiar with Octavio Paz, but maybe not as many his wife, who is an artist. And this is actually one of my favorite books of poetry for how thin it is. It's that inspirational to me, so I would definitely suggest it to anyone. Figures and Figurations. It is Octavio writing poems about his wife's artwork. So I also wrote a poem about her artwork. And you would have, unfortunately, another one I can't really prop up too well. One thing that's important to see is that she uses found objects in very unique and surreal patterns. She just invents, in quite literally, entire worlds, almost entire mythologies based on things that she finds, and humanizing that. I'm just creating one of my favorites, creating an entire city, an entire universe out of these little hooks. Just beautiful and very inspirational to me. So that's mainly what you have to know there. And there you go. That's one of the pieces there with Mount Fuji on it. And this is my poem for Maria Jose Paz. It is called The Whiteness of the Hours, and it's 3 short sections. Such exaltation in the broken, discarded. Something speaks from within buttons and used postage stamps, untwined ribbon and wire, crochet needles that have known the sweat of 200 hands. Rust penetrates only so deep, and we are left alone to dream ourselves lovely again. The terrible thing about closure is the absence of permanent locks. All it takes, the gentlest breeze from a cracked window, the gentlest heart, its touch of fire, a simple reimagining to push the sealed door open, rendering silence meaningful. The smoke of guitar heavy in banished objects, strings unwound from the body, memory and worse, purpose, having outlived the reason for living, but still to exist in some broken, forgettable form, always on the verge of song. That is for Marie. And last, but hopefully not least, there is actually a journal that specializes in this. It's called The Light Ekphrastic, which is an online poetry and art journal. And they had approached me a few months back. And they what they do is they match poets that they hear of somewhere and match them up with artists. And so I agreed. And they sent me this piece from an artist. I'm terribly sorry that I forget her name. And I think it's going to be published in the next issue of that online journal. But yeah, so they pretty much they gave me that, so I had to sit on that for a while. And then it turned very, very cold here, so it was much easier to write about it. The first one, obviously, I have 2 poems based on this art piece. I should get out of the way so people can see it. And the first one is also, in addition to being about this, is also for Walt Whitman. He's very much in this, and it is called The Decision. And we have a decision before she has a decision. I'm assuming it's a she. I don't know why I think that's a she. That seems like a she, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not really sure why. Okay. We will lose you regardless in the dead grass under this mirror of snow. We will walk the same path, child feet swallowed by your prints, to discover your bones scattered by a century of words. We will unearth from the soil that's harder than us all, and pass on our decision to love despite. We will choose to heal, and you will be there in absence, consolation of color, in a monochromed skeleton of forest, our name blood-signed, red, in the dead grass under this mirror. So I was thinking of Mr. Whitman there, and kind of writing to him, I guess. And the other piece The other poem pertaining to this piece is called Unmapping. To converse with a winter forest by choosing a path heavied by unbroken snow. To argue with each branch before rending it from body for the fire you're about to become. To ask the lost animal inside how to read from a map of stars whose names you've forgotten. And at this final hour, to begin divorcing your sky, your limbs, and path from their proximity to the unmirrored universe. So that is, I'll leave them up. Okay. So that is those are just a few ekphrastic poems. And if I may, I wanted to, actually I'm going to preface this other section quickly with a poem that I had written about a year and a half ago for a fellow Oregon poet, as some people perhaps know. He's still very much emerging, but he's honestly one of my favorite poets, regardless of knowing him, down in Eugene. Sam Roderick Roxas Shuha, for those who know him. Very, very good friend, and actually wrote a poem for my wife and I's wedding, which is amazing, but that is not why I sing his praise. You know him, yeah. It's hard not to be enamored by his poetry. Very personal, very metaphorical and surreal at the same time. And I wrote this for him in that I was attempting to do what he does in my own voice. And this is called "I Go to the Ruined Place," and it's a poem about returning to where you're from, I guess, which for me is the Boston area, and having returned there for the first time in 3 years or so last year. And looking at the house that I grew up in, spent 18 years in, and it looked more foreign than anything I think I've ever seen. It just didn't, I've been to other countries, it wasn't half as foreign as going back home. And looking through that childhood window that obviously has been repurposed to a different room, and just the street and everything just seemed so weird, so foreign. So yeah, it's called "I Go to the Ruined Place." Immigrant, I walk the town that raised me. I study the estranged hues of once known trees, so many blacks and whites, a handful of birds, forgotten flight patterns. I follow the street that winds along the river down to my lower lip, shattered mirror in my blood, brick behind my back. Windows, so like my eyes, stare back, foreign, from the corner house with broken lashes. Distant, I can hear a dead boy still marking the walls in crayon inside. And I did. I saw a little face in there, and I swear it must have been mine because my parents don't have any other kids. For better or worse, I actually got to read for my parents. They've never seen me read I don't know how many readings I've done in different states, and they've never seen me read. So I actually read, they were in Ashland, visiting there, and they went to a reading there at the library that I was doing for the first time. So there were a whole bunch of poems I decided not to read, and that was one of them. But, and I just want to read, I have a number of ongoing series in addition to individual poems, and one of which is, I guess, what I'm calling, and don't be too sad by the sound of it, the Dead Boy poems. And it actually came from that, where I can hear a dead boy still marking the walls in crayon on the side, which I'd written about a year and a half ago. And then just recently, about 6 months ago, that started bothering me because I'm not really talking about a dead boy, obviously. So I really enjoyed that metaphor, the fact that one could be talking about an actual, it could be a literal interpretation of a dead boy, or it could be, there's so many metaphors innately associated with it that it automatically adds a certain layer of ambiguity just by referencing that in a title. It could be obviously your youth, the child one once was inside being dead, for example, in the last poem. So I have a whole bunch, probably 15 or so at this stage, of dead boy poems. This one is called A Dead Boy. Yeah, I know, that sounds very, yeah. This one is called A Dead Boy Fishes with His Dead Grandfather. I know, not as common. I wish I could keep up the level of comedy there, but I fear that I'll probably fail there. The fish have broken the line again, Grandpa, and everything we've held runs silver through our hands and out. Across the never-ending surface, disruptions and echoes, waves our crooked fingers cannot flatten. Our lines travel without us, you and I and the lives we must end. But not today. Today we have lost the death that keeps us. Today we reverse. You are my child, and I will love you for the childish stories I've heard. About the dead you cannot erase, muddied uniforms and flags marked by the smallest red suns. About how Grandma combs the long dried blood from your thinning hair with her thinning hand. About how each kindness is a reason to remain unpardoned. How memory writhes below skin and is its own decision, devour or release. I will decide to love the empty hook of your body like a warning. Your hands, what they've calloused and where they've healed. Today I will pretend to understand why you cry like a knife. I can't seem to read this poem, I apologize. Today I will pretend to understand why you cry like a knife stroke when I throw you back. That is not autobiographical. In this, a dead boy speaks to his parents. Hush now, you don't have to be anymore. Whatever script you'd written for the stars to follow, they've missed their mark, gone true right instead of stage right. Nightly you whisper, ever since, perhaps because, or even before, but you don't have to thread cause through effect, or rummage through whatever beginnings you've captured on film to discover a fixed point of departure. The zoetrope continues to spin without image. Mom and Dad, you don't have to be contained anymore. Between the lines, I never had time to write on the stars that don't listen anyway. That one's perhaps a bit more literal in terms of the dead boy, perhaps, but and I wanted to. This one is a dead boy dreams Bangladesh. Temple and mosque, stone obelisk painted to appear as heaven. Its gold flashes momentarily and is gone with each passing cloud. Someone asks me how to enter the door inside belief. A flurry of white robes replace orange silk, each the same language, then a poverty of birds. Church bells unsteady the trees and glass towers, a tone for the structures, unrooted song. I still tell myself I can sing like that, confidently unambiguous. Someone I want to love wails into open air at this prescribed time. Someone I don't recognize touches his forehead to concrete for the 5th time today. A monk sweeps clear his path before stepping forward into the light. A leper covets coins, one for each missing wing. Someone says God in the openness of a palm inclined upward. Someone else leaves this openness empty and fulfilled. Sometimes I wonder if we got here by ritual alone, interred beneath words no heavier than a wing, left to knock with a father's hand at this gateless city. And if I may, finally, just the last little dead boy poem here. If anyone has been to the Grotto here in Portland, and this is kind of where this comes from. And for anyone who hasn't, of course, with all grottos in general, there is usually a water source. Obviously, the concave rock, obviously a statue within. And this is called A Dead Boy Visits the Grotto. It's not God, I fear, these roads will wind toward, but concave rock hollowed to fit my fist. In the center of me stands one gleaming statue, unmovable, that always catches the light just right, or is caught and held by the sun like crucifixed arms, like the varied meaning behind a lake of candles, like prayer if one could pray by burning. I fear even history is a garden of man-made stone. Then there's the stream, always an incision of fresh water leading up to the foot of the promise. I wash my own feet and remember grandmother's eyes hollowed to fit belief. Eventually the light wanes. That is to say, I cannot stop my fist from smothering it. Each road ends in stone. That is to say, please. So I'm going to put the dead boys away, and they're sad. I just, if I may, just wanted to end. I didn't want to read too much from it, both because I read a lot from it, and also, yeah, if anyone wants to ask any questions, obviously, afterwards or about this, I just want to read just a couple quick poems. They're usually quite short in this collection, from my new book that just came out earlier in the year. And I was just going to read a couple quick poems from it. They're, again, quite short. And what you'll see in Controlled Hallucinations is, for those who aren't familiar with the concept of it, it's very much like lucid dreaming. So each poem is just numbered instead of having a name, and hopefully work together as well as apart. This poem, which is one of my only love poems, I don't usually do love poems, but we are born of a question and dance together, apart together as its answer. We are born and rush from the dim room of certainties out into the vast, bright, unanswerable. You are born and I am born every day as strangers. The wonder isn't that we love as if from different cities, but that we are different cities, absent rail tracks, wires, common language, yet still we wake in unison. I think that was a Valentine's Day poem a few years ago, if I recall. Don't turn around and stare, though. She doesn't like that. This is another kind of going back to childhood. I mean, it would, but this is another one quickly, going back to childhood. And I was trying to think of that idea of, as a child, that perhaps certain attributes you have as a child end up becoming who you are as an adult, or they hint at what you may become as an adult. And in this instance, which is actually a true story, and I did read this in front of my parents, and they were just nodding their head, yeah, like, that kind of happened, was for those who are familiar, yeah, it's not a good thing, for those who are familiar with The Perfect Storm, the book or the movie, or obviously it's based on reality, coming from the East Coast, we very much were hit by that, and I mean, it took a tree out of our yard. I mean, it was pretty severe. And a lot of people are running around doing all sorts of practical things, you'll see. And that wasn't, I guess, my approach when the storm came. When I was a child and a storm approached, others assisted their families with the shutters and shovels. Others counted the time between claps and flashes. I would cry out a list of synonyms for what was to come. Tempest, blizzard, gale, squall, cloudburst, chaos, upheaval. We were then what we would soon become. I still react in words, take comfort in their distance. That opened it up to a Q&A at that particular event afterwards. They're like, oh, so they asked my parents, who were sitting right there and very nervous. They're not into books and such, shall we say. And they asked if that really happened. They're like, yeah, I kind of like grabbed a thesaurus when a storm was coming. I'm like, oh, what's going on? What's this about? What's a storm? You know, I got really excited about it. Instead of helping with shingles and stuff, which we lost. Just it's getting a bit late, and I want to make sure that, if anyone wants to ask any questions, I want to make sure that there's time for that. So, literally about 2 incredibly short poems. This one is kind of fun. It's one of the last ones in the book. Each lake is a pinhole poked from a larger map of land. Each nameless roadside creek is born of curious scissors. I am sorry, cartographer of my life. I love the water too much to stop drilling here. The whole purpose of that poem was to get the word cartographer in there. It's been bothering me forever. I was like, I have to get cartographer in a poem. Yeah, I was very happy. And this is just the last poem I'll read, and it's the last poem in this collection also. And again, thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me, and in the library, and in the city of Milwaukie, my new home. And so this is the last poem here, and if anyone has any questions after, just obviously let me know. The rough edges of a church's cornerstone, or the guilty side of a prison wall, or the innocent. This tree might one day be a hearth's fire, or a cross looming high over abandoned winter fields. Either the house is being torn down around us, or our feet are permanent, as it should be. Look up to discover a tiny tear in the cold blue curtain, and struggle the rest of your life not to pull down the sky. I know only one thing. There is no unknowing. And thank you again, everyone, for coming out and bearing the cold. Questions? I apologize. I didn't drink any of this the whole month.
Excuse me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, sir. I don't know if there are 2 hands. I'm not sure which to do. If you don't mind, I'm going to say ladies first. If you don't mind, Tom.
No.
Yes.
It's a long time since I've been called a lady.
Is it
How old were you when you started writing?
poetry or anything in general? I started writing short stories, which I still do infrequently, maybe a couple a year. But I started writing short stories when I was about 8. And I was a middle school teacher, took one of my pieces without telling me, and actually submitted it somewhere. And it was published somewhere. I wish I had it. I don't know what it was. But and that was before online, of course. And he just kind of gave it to me like a year later when I was in the next grade. And he's like, oh, by the way, I submitted this thing that you wrote for class. And it was in some kid magazine. Yeah. So but poetry, 22, maybe? I'm 35 now. So I think it was about 22. And the very first poem I wrote, I didn't like poetry, probably until I was 25. So I wrote really bad poetry for 3 years because I didn't actually like reading it. I just wanted to write something that wasn't a story, and I didn't know what I was doing. And when I lived in New York, Albany, New York, I actually, it's very embarrassing, but I was sitting on a deck, on this feet in the water in a little lake there downtown. And something just came to me, and I wasn't sure what to do. And I was writing stories a lot more then, like every day. But I didn't know what to do with myself. There was something, and it didn't have a character or a plot, and it didn't have anything. I didn't know what to do. So I actually had a marker in a bag with me. So I took out a marker, and I was, it's the summer, so I, just had swimming trunks on and stuff, just sitting there. And I just started writing all over my arms. And so I actually wrote a poem, which I think I still have saved on my computer, and no one's ever allowed to see, including my wife. And I think it's called The Dock. It's embarrassing, but I actually wrote the poem on me because I didn't know yet that you're supposed to bring a pen and a pad of paper, even up here. I didn't know you were supposed to do that. So I think I was 22, when I wrote my first poem. Thank you. And then I read poetry at 25 or 26. Yes, Tom, sorry.
My question is about controlled hallucinations. And how did you get the idea for the book? And the poems in it, did you write them in a fairly short period of time, or did that evolve? Did you write them over a long period of time and put them in the book?
Well, I write, for better or worse, I write a lot, pretty much every day. So I think, I mean, it's not like everything made it in there, and there are other things that went into other works, you know, and such. But it probably was over the course of, let's say, a year-ish, and that all of those were written. And some of them had titles, and originally were going to have nothing to do with this, and I stripped them of the titles in order to put them in the collection. And others were specifically for it. So it's kind of a mix in that regard. I had a whole bunch without titles that I felt there were a few similar images here and there, and also I felt similar themes. And I definitely found it interesting, and had read a book and knew one or two people who were interested in the idea of lucid dreaming, of that idea of, you know, trying to control their dreams while sleeping, which I'm not sure if they're successful. I'm not sure if I believe in it, but I think it's a very interesting concept. So I was writing some pieces for that, and it was probably about half of that collection. And then the rest were poems I already had that had similar themes that I just stripped the titles off of, and yeah.
Do you write at a set time?
I write, I prefer Twilight for some reason. I like that. But whenever. I write in the car, which isn't safe. I write in traffic. I've written entire poems in traffic. But I write everywhere, except for home. I find it very difficult to write at home, which is weird. But everywhere else, outside, in cafes, at parks, in the car. 15-minute breaks at work. I have my half-hour break at work every single day. Earlier today too, even if there's no break room or anything like that. So I actually just go. I just put gloves on, a scarf on, and everything. I just sit outside and write for half an hour, and then I go back to work. I do that every day. So pretty much wherever I can.
I have a question. Were you an only child, or?
Does it show?
Well, I have an only son,
Mhm.
so you remind me of him a little bit.
Hopefully that's a good thing.
But he's old.
Just kidding.
I really like your Dead Boy
Oh, thank you.
poems a lot. And I was just curious, do you have them published yet?
Some of them, the Dead Boy
Or are you going to make a
Dead Boy series.
little book that would just be a...
I think that's going to be a chapter with each. That was the first full. I mean, I had a whole bunch of chapbooks out earlier. This is my first full length. I have another full length that I had completed. And I like each one being different because it's more exciting for me, and also, it's wonderful. There's poets. Let's just say like a Pablo Neruda, who I enjoy, but at the same time, I kind of feel like once I've read, a couple of his books, then I begin to find I'm like, well, you know what I mean. There's a point where I kind of feel like that. I felt like he's perhaps writing the same thing. A lot of Tropical Birds, for example, and of course the political poems too. But I just find it often more interesting with poets that I find when their books are different in one way or another, structurally or something else. So I was doing something a little bit different with a manuscript I completed a few months ago, and I'm submitting to presses now. So then I'm working on the third book now, which is broken into longer chunks of thematic-based things, so that it would be one without titles, one that's more of a traditional approach with normal titles, and then the next one, the one I'm working on now, in chunks, like probably 4 or 5 different chunks, one of which is the Dead Boy series. And then I have, and then a couple other chunks like that. So that's kind of what I'm doing, I guess, right now. So I think I have 15 or 16 of them at this point.
That's what you were saying, so I was just kind of curious if you had those in a collection of sorts.
Yeah, I think my general goal is to have between 25 and 30 for each section, and then maybe 5 sections. That would be a book, Yeah, well, thank you. Those are a bit more personal and deal, of course. I'm always nervous about questioning. It's important to question everything. Most of us are probably poets, so they're used to that. But one always gets nervous in a group talking about religion, questioning religion, trying to compare religions, which is a minor I had an undergraduate degree too. So I find that stuff very interesting, where people create divisions where perhaps there are similarities instead and things like that. But one always gets nervous reading such things out there, and also bringing in one's own grandparents and things like that. So thank you. I appreciate that. I haven't read those too much.
They're great.
I'm sorry. Yes.
So I wasn't familiar with the term you used, ekphrastic.
Oh, yes.
Could you say what that is? My assumption, based on what you did, is that it relates to having a piece of art or something like that in and being tasked for, being inspired by it and writing about it. Can you say
Yeah.
a little bit more about that and what appeals to you about that, or what's drawn?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's the communication, I guess, between two art forms. Whether it be mutual inspiration or one being purely inspired by the other. For me, it's mainly been art, but also a little bit of photography, one or two photographs also. And actually, oddly enough, with a song, I actually wrote a short story, like a flash fiction short story in a 3-section short story, about 5 pages long, that was actually based on a song, loosely, which is, I've never done that before. That was kind of odd. But so pretty much in that regard, yes, absolutely. Something, a specific piece or specific artist or musician, something really strikes you. And what it's your response to that. Like you're trying to start, I believe, in writing a poem toward it, I'm trying to start a communication with that piece, and hopefully it will communicate back on some level, if that makes sense.
Is that something that you've found yourself doing kind of as long as you've been writing, or is it something you've been drawn to more recently as an approach?
I don't know about on purpose. More on purpose the past year or so. I think in general, I think we take in so much in our lives that you don't always know, you can't, trace back what a given inspiration is for a given image or something like that. But yes, more frequently recently, for some reason, specific pieces of art and things like that have just been really touching me in a way that I just, have been providing me with words in which to talk to them with, whereas before it hasn't necessarily been the case. If that makes sense. Oh, no, thanks. All right. Well, again, thank you very much for coming out.